Hi class. This is the second video on class inheritance. In this video I'll be reviewing concept of class inheritance. In this case I'll be creating a class to handle our scenes. I'll be adding a few things in this video, including the scene class for our map scene as well as the platform game scene. And I'll be adding a couple other objects to round out the functionality of the game that we have so far. So to get started, I'm going to open up my GitHub desktop as usual. Make sure I'm on the MMP 310 repo. And I'm going to click View on GitHub. To start, like I did in the last video, I'm going to open up my code on GitHub. I'm going to open project 1-5, which is the function-based version of this project, where I have this very long sketch file. And I'm going to keep that open because I have some functionality in here that I'm going to want to just copy and paste from here rather than writing from scratch. I'm going to also open in Sublime Text. And so in the last video, we started project 1-6, and we created the game object class. And based on that game object class, I also created the cloud class, the player class, and the portal class. So we're going to continue working with our project to add in a scene class to handle multiple versions of our scene, and then a platform class to handle multiple versions of the arcade or platform game in our project. I'm going to open up sketch.js. And so we're going to start here and then begin organizing our project into different scenes. I'm going to start the Sublime server and then open up our project in the browser. So I'm going to go to localhost 8080, MMP 310, and then I'm going to type in the URL here because I haven't created this link yet, project 1-6. And so this is where we left off last time. I can move my character and I have my trees and my clouds and my scene portals or my signs, but I can't actually use those yet. So that's what we're going to be working on today, is making new scenes within the game. So the first thing that we want to do is map out our scene class. So like we did last time, we have to break down our different types of scenes. So in the game right now, we have our main scene. And the type of scene this is basically like a map where our player can walk around. We also have 3 different platform scenes of various difficulties: easy, medium, and hard. We also have a couple scenes, win and lose, that basically just give a prompt to the player. So when I'm designing my classes, I want to look at what are the things that these scenes have in common. So when I look at my code from my previous project, I have the main scene here, function main, has the controls for the player, it draws the signs, and then it draws some game objects. Then I have the game scene, which has a background color and then a ground, the physics for jumping and gravity, and then drawing the obstacles or the snakes. Then I have the win and lose scene, which have some text and some instructions on the scene. After reviewing the 3 different types of scenes, I can see that there really isn't anything in common between these scenes. The only thing that's in common between these 2 scenes is that the player is drawn, player.draw. Everything else is different. And there's basically nothing in common between the main scene or platform scene and the win and lose scene. And so in that case, rather than try to figure out a way to incorporate all of these into one class, I'll make 3 separate classes. I'm going to make a map scene class, a platform scene class, and for my win and lose scene, this is really more of like a prompt. So a prompt is like when the computer asks you, click yes or no. That's essentially what's happening in the win or lose scene. So I'm going to create 3 different scenes, but they're all going to have similar methods, a setup and a draw method. And so that way I can be drawing any scene and refer to any instance of these different types of scenes. So I'm going to keep that in mind as I build out my scenes. So let's start with our map scene. Essentially what I'm going to do here is look at basically everything from the setup function and the draw function that could be added to the map scene instead of my main draw function. So I'm going to open up a second panel over here so that I can compare my two files. And I'm going to save this as my first type of scene, which is the MapScene.js. And of course, I need to remember to add that to my index.html. So I have my game object, my cloud, my player, and my portal. And now I just need my map scene. So when I'm creating a new class, I start with the class keyword and then the name of the class. And again, this is capitalized to distinguish a class from a function. And I always have a constructor function when I start a new class. The constructor function in this case is going to do some of the things that a setup function would normally do. But we'll also add a separate setup function because we can load the scene more than once when we go to one scene and then come back to another. So we'll also have a setup function. And then finally, we'll have a draw function to draw the scene when we're in that scene. So let's look through the code that we have in sketch.js and decide where it belongs in our map scene. To start, we have these image variables. We're going to leave those in place along with the preload function. We want to preload all of our images in the main sketch, so I'm just going to collapse that and leave that as is. Then looking at these variables here, the trees, the clouds, and the portals are all things that belong specifically in a scene. So I'm going to move those variables over to my map scene. For my map scene, I'll have some trees. So I'll say this dot trees equals an empty array. So I'll add the trees later. So that takes care of my variable trees. Again, when I'm using class syntax, instead of using a var here, if I want these trees to be available to each one of my functions, I use this dot trees and then the empty array. So I'll also have this dot clouds is an empty array, and then this dot portals equals an empty array. And so I can just delete these variables. So now instead of having a bunch of separate arrays to draw the scene, I'll just have one scene for my map scene. And I'm going to call this the main scene. So I'll just say variable main, and we'll instantiate that in our setup function. So now we have one global player variable and one global main variable for our main scene. In our setup function, this stuff is related to the canvas and how we're drawing our text. So I'm going to leave all of that alone. But the trees belong to our scene. And so I'm going to move this over to the constructor of our map scene. So the trees are always going to be the same in our map scene, so we can build them once and then leave them. And we may not be in the scene, but whenever we return the scene, the trees will stay the same. I can copy and paste these over. One thing I have to be careful to do is that I no longer just have trees, I have this dot trees. So I have to be careful to refer to this dot trees, etc. This is only if you're copying and pasting. If you're writing it from scratch, of course, you can just write, begin writing with this dot. So I'll delete that. Next, for my second group of trees, originally I had these kind of in the foreground. So if I wanted to add these to be in the foreground, I could make a separate array. So I could have my trees that draw in the background. Maybe I could call that background. And then I could have a foreground for my foreground trees. And so I'll copy in this for loop. The code works exactly the same. I just want to indent this over. I'm going to go to single view for a second. But now instead of trees, I want to use this dot foreground. And so the foreground is anything that's going to draw in front of the player. And I could change this to background if I wanted to be a little bit more generic, because I might add things other than trees in the future. So let's change this to background. And now we've updated our background and our foreground trees. So we can draw things in the background behind the player and things in the foreground in front of the player. So let's keep going. I'm going to go back to my split view. Clouds is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to copy and paste these over. And again, I'm going to make sure to include this dot in front of each of the clouds. Again, you can feel free to write these from scratch. The player doesn't belong to the scene, so I'm going to leave the player as is. The portals do belong to the scene, but I'm going to create new portals for this one, so I'm just going to delete these for now. And we'll get to that in a minute. So now I have my player, and then I have my main map scene. So I'm going to say main equals new map scene. And at the moment, there are no arguments for this scene because we're basically just drawing the scene. There's not going to be any differences at the moment. So I have my main equals new map scene. Now in my draw function, rather than drawing everything from my map scene, I want to move this stuff into the map scene itself. And then I'll use the draw function to draw the map scene. A lot of this I'm just going to copy and paste over to the draw function of my map scene. So background 220, we'll go there. So to draw, instead of drawing my trees, I'm going to draw the background elements after I draw the background. So I'm going to say for let I equals 0, I is less than this dot background dot length. Let's go back to single view. So background is my array, and I can push whatever elements I want to push there. So I have this dot background dot length, and then I++. Then to draw those elements, because they are all game objects, each one that I added here is a game object, I'll just say this dot background at I to get each individual game object, and then dot draw. So we haven't really finished everything yet, but we can test this just to make sure everything's working so far. So instead of drawing my background and my trees, I'm going to say main.draw to test that my main scene is working. And we're going to get an error for the portals, so let's comment this out for now, as well as the clouds. So we can see our trees are drawing, and I can move my character around. And so if I wanted to add something besides trees to the background, now that's a lot easier. Instead of creating a whole new array and adding a bunch of other stuff, I just make a new game object. For a quick demonstration of adding new elements, I made a couple of assets to add to the scene. So I'll just add those images. So I downloaded those to my downloads folder from Pascal. I made a bush, not that great, but spent like 2 seconds on it, and a rock. So I didn't spend a ton of time on these, but I just wanted to have some examples. So I'm gonna drop these guys in here and go back to my code. So now I can add these very easily. So I need to preload them first. So I'll say variable rock image and bush image. And then I'll preload those along with my other images. Those are PNGs because they're not animated. So once I load those images, all I have to do is put them in the background. So I can say this dot background dot push new game object. So since they're not moving or updating in any way, I don't need to create special game objects. I just use the same game object I used for my tree with a rock. So I'll put in some random values here. So I'll add one rock and one bush just as examples. So now we see those other images and they behave exactly the same way as our trees in that they really don't do much. I'm going to move the bush down a bit. And if I want to add more, I can do that. And since they're in the background, my player will walk on top of them. Once I add the foreground, I can add things to the foreground as well. I'm going to move my rock down a bit too. So I can easily update new images to my scene. So let's keep adding new stuff into the map scene. So we have our player events. All of these are specific to a map scene. So I'm just going to drop that whole bunch of code in there. And that's not really going to change at all. So a map scene involves the player walking up, down, right, and left to find different portals. So that's totally fine. We'll leave that there. So I'll deal with the portals once we create those portals in a second. For the player, we might leave this in the draw scene, but we can also put it in the map scene. Putting it in the map scene will allow us to draw the background behind the player and the foreground in front of the player. So that's going to be a better scenario. So let's move player.draw into our map scene, and then we can draw the clouds on top. So for the clouds, I could just copy and paste the for loop that I used for the background, but let's write it from scratch just to review. So for my for loop, I have for, as usual, let I equal 0, so I'm counting from 0. Now I have this .clouds.length, so I'm going to count through each one of my clouds and then count up by 1. And then I'll draw my clouds. So this .clouds at I.draw. And then, of course, with my clouds, there's an animation, so I need to update them as well. This .clouds at I.update. My background and foreground elements don't animate, so I don't need to update them. So now let's draw our foreground. For let I equal 0, I is less than this .foreground.length, I++. This .foreground at I.draw. So now with the background elements, our character stays on top. For the foreground elements, our character is behind. And then our clouds, we can actually walk up to the clouds, which a lot of you guys have figured out ways to constrain that, so I won't bother going over that in this video, but if you want to know how to do that and you can't do it, just let me know. But our character can walk up here and then we'll be covered by the clouds, which I think makes sense. So that's one scene. Now that we have a MapScene class, what we can do is actually create what we can do now is create more scenes that use the same functionality, but it's going to be a lot easier because we've already created that functionality. And so we can extend that to other scenes. By using this .background and this .foreground, we're kind of making the scenes more generic. So you might have one scene that's just all rocks or all bushes, and then you can use the background and foreground rather than, this .bushes or this .rocks. So by using classes, we can draw any foreground elements we want as long as they all have a draw function. And we can draw any background elements as we want, as long as they have a draw function. And we can use the same player walking logic. We don't have to repeat that for our different scenes because we have these separate classes. So now let's make more scenes based on the MapScene class. And to do that, we'll have to figure out what's different between this scene versus the other scenes that we want to draw. We can also reintroduce our portals as a way of moving between the different scenes. So if I want to have more than one map scene, I'm going to want to think about how can I take my map scene class and then make multiple map scenes based on it. There's a couple things to consider here. I want to think about how different the scenes will be. One thing that I could do is add arguments. So I could keep one main map scene class and then I could have arguments to change the number of trees or the number of portals or the number of clouds. So I could add some arguments here like num, trees, etc., etc. And that would change those aspects of the map, but it wouldn't really change like the overall map. So if I really want like two completely different maps, then what I want to start to think about is how do I have a map scene as a main class and then extend that to, let's say I have 3 scenes that I'm traveling through. So I'll also have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So let's say for each of these scenes, I have a different layout and different challenges or arcade scenes and different things that can be found. So what I want to do is figure out what is the same and then what's different. So they probably all have a foreground and a background. They probably all have clouds. They probably all have portals. But the specific instances of these trees, for instance, are probably going to be different. So I'd move these into a new scene. Everything here as well. The setup function we actually haven't gotten to yet. I think we'll get to that in a moment. The draw function is basically going to be the same, right? We're going to have the same background color. We're going to want to draw the background, whatever happens to be there. We're going to have to move the player, so we want the same player events and drawing the player. We'll have to draw the clouds, and we'll have to draw the foreground elements. So by looking through my code, what I've determined is that most of this stuff is going to stay the same. What will change is here. the elements that I add to the scene. With that in mind, let's create some new scenes. So I'm going to return to my split view, and I'm going to make a new file on the right and save this. And I'm just going to call this beginning.js. This will be my beginning scene. I'm starting to have a lot of files here, so you might want to use folders or something like that. I'm just going to leave things the way they are. But you can use folders as long as you link them correctly. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to make sure to add these scripts as I add them. So under the map scene, I'll put beginning. And then I know I'm going to make them, so I'll just add middle and end now to save myself some time later. It might be appropriate to add scene at the end of these. It just kind of depends on how many files you have. As long as you know what beginning, middle, and end refer to, that's fine. If you had like a lot of different scenes, you might want to start to use scene in the name there. So for my beginning scene, we have class beginning, extends map scene, and we're going to have a constructor as usual. I'm going to call the super constructor. So remember that the super refers to whatever class is being extended. So in this case, that's the map scene. And so inside the constructor, super just calls the constructor of the map scene. And I'm going to let that set up our background array, our foreground array, our clouds, and our portals. But the specific elements that I want in the beginning, I'm going to move over here. So I'm going to take these guys, just paste them here, take all these guys, and paste them in here. And then I'm just going to clean up those spaces a bit. So we are moving code around a lot, so it can be confusing. But we can also start to make these from scratch. So I just want to test this first. I don't need any other functions at the moment, just the constructor, just set up the scene. So I'm just going to test this first. So now my main scene, instead of being a map scene, is now the beginning. So let's test that. So that still seems to be working fine. I'm getting some errors because I haven't created those other files yet, but I'll create those shortly. Let's make the middle scene. I'm going to call this class middle, extends map scene. And just as I did in the last example, let's save this as middle.js. So like I did in the last example, I'm going to have a constructor, and the first thing I'm going to call is the super constructor from the map scene. So we'll get those arrays, but now I'm going to add some stuff. And let's say in the middle scene, maybe I just want to add a lot of trees. So I'll just make a big nested for loop. I'll say for let I equals 0. Or actually, let's use the grid here. So let's say for let x equals 0, x is less than width, x plus plus. And then I'm going to put another loop inside of there to make a big grid. Let y equals 0, y is less than height, y plus plus. And so now let's add a whole bunch of trees. So I'm going to create a new tree. I'm going to say let tree equal new game object. For my game object, the first argument is the image I want. So that's the tree image. And then the x and y value, which I'm getting from my nice big nested loop. Say x and y. And I just realized I put plus plus here because I've been using a lot of arrays, but that's going to be way too many. So let's do plus equals. Let's try 50 to start. So I'll try 50 on x and plus equals 50 on y. The nice thing about using classes now is that I don't actually have to change the draw loop. My foreground or background is all I have to add here. So once I've created the tree, I just say this dot background dot push to add the new tree, and I'll get a new tree. And so to test this scene, I'm going to make a new variable. So I have main, and then I have beginning. And I'm going to say beginning equals new. Oh, wait, this is middle. Let's say middle. And let's say middle equals new middle. And then I'll just say middle.draw. So that should draw my middle scene. And that's way too many trees. So let's just fix this real quick. So let's say like 100 on the X and maybe 150 on the Y since they're taller. That looks good. Maybe I want them to overlap a little bit, but I'll leave that for now. And then let's actually cut out the trees in the middle. So I'm going to add a little logic here. So I'm going to say if X is less than, let's say, width over 3. So we'll cover the first third of the scene with trees. Just going to add in. And I'm gonna do this kind of quickly because you guys probably have different scene designs that you want. So let's say either X is less than width over 3 or X is greater than width minus width over 3. So just coming in from the other side. Okay, so that creates a nice little line down the middle. And it looks a little too rigid. So if you're working with like a pattern or something, you might like that. But since I'm working with trees, I want it to be a little random. So maybe I'll do like -50 to 50 on X. That looks good. And maybe -100 to 100 on Y, just kind of playing with different values. And so now we kind of have a nice like little path down the middle. If we want to add some rocks in there, we could do the opposite. So we could say if this, we add trees, else let rock equals new game object. And we'll put a rock image in here. And I'm just going to copy in the X and Y for that. And then I'm going to push that. So I'm going to say this.background.push rock. And now I have some rocks. And so I am using some randomness here. So this is going to change each time I play the game. But the nice thing about using this constructor function, it's a bit like setup. So it's only going to happen once when I first load that scene. And so in one instance of the game, I'll always have the same rocks and trees right there. So that looks pretty good. There's a lot of things that you might want to tweak and fix, like, you know, this rock is overlapping that tree and that looks kind of weird. So, you know, maybe we would change the way we do our loops or something like that. But I think this is pretty good. So I'm just going to stick with this. And so let's build the end scene. I'm going to go to double view here and make a new file here and save as end.js. So I have the beginning, the middle, the end. So class end extends MapScene. And we'll have a constructor again. And so for this one, why don't we do something similar, but we'll just do like some rocks going across. So I'll say for let x equals 0. Oh, I have to make sure to call the super function here. So for let x equals 0, x is less than width, x plus equals 50. And then for this one, I'm going to start y a little bit farther down the page. So I'll say for let y equals, let's say, height over 2. Y is less than height. Y plus equals 50. And so now I'll add some rocks or some bushes. So I'll say if y is less than height over 2 plus height over 4. So I'm just moving 3/4 of the way down the screen. I'll say let rock equals new game object. And I'll add the rock image. And I'll put that at XY. And I'll add some randomness. I'm going to add a little less here so it's a little more even. Okay, so then else I'll add those bushes. So since I made the bushes, and don't forget to add the rock to the background. So this dot background dot push rock, and then let bush equal new game object bush image, and I'll use the same XY. So I'm just going to copy this and paste this down here. And this dot, let's put these in the foreground. It'll kind of look weird if my player walks over it, but you know, that's something that you could fix if you wanted to. So I'm just gonna put end here and say end equals new end. And just for testing, we'll say end.draw. Okay, so that looks pretty cool. The rocks are kind of dark here. So maybe I could change the artwork or add a different style of rock. And I'd actually like a little bit more randomness on the Y. So let's build that up to 20. Okay, that looks decent. And he's kind of behind these bushes. So you can play around with that. Eventually you'll get something that you like. Anyway, this is good enough for what I want to do. The trick here now is I got to move in between these scenes, right? And at the moment, I'm just using the code to change which scene I see, but I want the user to be able to do it. So that's where I'm going to create these signs. So for each scene, I'll add in a sign to go to the next scene. So I'm going to close these for a second, and let's go to, I'm going to rename main to beginning, just so I know what I'm talking about. And so we're going to add in our portals to each scene. And then we'll have to add in the drawing for the portals into our main map scene. So let's do that first. So I have sort of my portal drawing and code here. So let's do that. So we want to draw that before we draw the player, but after we do the player movement, because we do want like the last update of the player. So I'll put that in here. So draw portals after last player update, before player draws. So that way the player appears on top of the portal. So this is going to look just like our clouds in our foreground. We're going to say for let I equals 0, I is less than this dot portals dot length, I plus plus. And we're going to draw the portals first. So we'll say this dot portals at I dot draw. Then we have to test if the portal collides with the player. So we did add our collide code into our game object. I'm going to go here. So we did all the collision code, and then we said we would return true or return false. And so this is where we finally get to use this. So we can detect the collision between each player and each portal and the player. And so since it's in a loop, we'll go through each portal one at a time. And one thing that we want to be a little bit careful about, because we are in a loop, is that if we detect a collision between a player and a portal, we don't want to immediately send the player into the next scene, because that could create issues if we're still looping through our other portals. So we want to be careful when we're using different classes that we're not stuck inside one loop while we're changing some big state about the program and going to like another scene or doing something like that, because we are going to eventually return to that loop. So all I'm going to do is say whether or not the player did interact with the portal, and if they did, then I'll save the name of the portal or the name of the scene that that portal goes to. This is a little bit tricky as far as like how this works, and it's something that eventually you'll learn by making this mistake and then figuring it out. So it may be a little counterintuitive at the moment, but basically the reason we're doing that is because with a for loop, we always have to remember that even though we might write some code here and then expect that we're moving on to the next part of their code, we have to remember that we're always going back to the beginning of the for loop once we go through each portal. So if there's two portals and we say that we want to go into one, but then somehow we detect a collision with the player in the other, it probably wouldn't happen that often, but if it does happen, if it is possible, that's going to lead to bugs. So we just want to be careful about that. So one way of approaching that is to use another variable. So we're going to say enterPortal, and I'm just going to leave this undefined. So if it's undefined, we'll never use it. If we do detect a collision between a player and a portal, then we'll set our enterPortal variable to the portal that we want from that scene. So to detect the collision, we say if this dot portals at I dot collide with the player. And so that is a really long piece of code, but essentially what I'm saying there is I'm taking the player and I'm putting it inside of the portal's collide method. So when we go over to the game object, this other is going to be the player, and this is the portal. And then we do our 2D box detection, all the stuff that we've gone over. And then if they do collide, we just say return true. If they don't collide, we say return false. And so this whole thing is either going to be true or false. If it's false, we just ignore it. That's fine. We're not colliding with the portal. If it's true, we want to do a couple things. We want to draw the text for that portal. So remember, our portal has a draw text function. So we want to draw the text to show the player that they're on top of the portal. So we're going to say this.portals at I.draw text. And then we want to detect the collision. We also want to look for the user input. So now we can say if key is down, enter. So if the user is over the portal and they hit the key, so say user input here, then we'll set the enterPortal value that we created previously, enterPortal, and we'll set that to the scene. So remember, we have the scene to open of our portal. So we'll just get that value and set that to enterPortal. So we'll say enterPortal equals this dot portals at I dot scene to enter. And then once we get out of our for loop, so we've looked at each one of our portals, we'll say if enterPortal. And that's a nice thing with JavaScript. If we don't define enterPortal, then this will fail because it will be undefined. So if they didn't hit enter on any of the portals here, then this will just be ignored. If they did, then what we're going to do is we're going to change the scene, and we're going to change the scene to the string saved under enterPortal, which is going to be whatever the scene to open that we put inside our portal is here. So there's a couple things here that we haven't actually created yet. We haven't created our changeScene function, and we haven't created the portal yet. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's add a portal to one of our scenes. So I'm going to close these guys out and get my two-pane view open, and I'll delete this code. So we've just got this nice clean draw function. Okay, so let's start obviously with the beginning. So we just need a portal to go to the end. We'll also add one for the platform levels later. And let's open up our portal class just so we can see what we need there. So we're gonna want to add a portal to our beginning scene. So let's remember which arguments we need for a portal. We need a message to tell the player where they're going, XY position, and then the name of the scene that we're going to. And so this is gonna be kind of a long line, so let's put this here. So what we're creating is a new portal, and the message is, let's say we're going into the forest. So enter the forest. The XY position, let's put it sort of on the right side of the screen. So I'll say like width minus 200 and put it towards the bottom, height minus 200. And then the scene that we're going to, so we're in the beginning scene, so we're gonna go to the middle scene. And I think that looks good. And so then we just have to push this onto our portals array. So we say this.portals.push, new parentheses, new portal, and then close that parentheses at the end. It's kind of a long line. You could break this up into two lines if you wanted to say like let middle portal equals, and we could put this here and then just say middle portal onto the array. So that might look a little bit cleaner to you, however you prefer to write it. And so now we should have a little portal down here. So let's walk down and take a look. So enter the forest, hit enter to play. Let's change that default portal thing because we're not always playing stuff anymore. So let's just say hit enter. I'll just say hit enter key so the user knows what to do. So now we can walk down here, enter the forest, hit enter key. When I hit enter, nothing's gonna happen. I don't actually have the changeScene function, so that's probably why, although I think it should have thrown an error. But let's add that changeScene function and just make sure that we get that. So when we change the scene, I want this to be like one of the main functions in my sketch.js. And the reason for that is that we're changing like a higher level, aspect of our program, like what scene we're drawing. And so I want to kind of bring that back out to the main program in sketch.js. So I'm just going to make this a global function, function changeScene. And obviously there's going to be an argument there, the scene name. And so now this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but we want to come up with a better way to manage our scenes. And we're going to use an object, what's actually called like an object literal, to do that. The reason there is like we could just say, current scene equals scene name here. And of course, that's what we did in the last one. And then we have our little conditional ladder where we say if current scene equals, beginning, da 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 da. But you can start to see we already have 3 scenes. I'm going to add like probably at least 3 more, maybe a bunch more. And so this is going to start to get really tedious, right? Having this gigantic if statement. So let's get rid of that and let's use an object literal instead. And the thing that's nice about an object literal is we can use the keys in our object to change the scene. So we can use, this label. Where's my portal? We can use this label that I get from my portal as a key for our object. So I'll demonstrate what that would look like. So we're going to have like a scenes variable, which is just an object. And so then we can say something like scenes.middle equals, middle scene. I'm just going to use a string for the moment, but we will use our scene classes. So now we have scenes. And the nice thing about this is I can reference scenes.middle, or I can reference scenes with the key middle, and that'll give me the same information. So the good thing about that is if I have a variable like scene name and that's set to middle, now I can reference a key in my object using a variable, as long as I design the code well enough that it's not like a blank variable. And so that was like kind of like a really quick overview of like how object literals work and objects in general. But it's not something that we're gonna like use a ton of, but I'm just using it here to save a lot of tedious if statements. And so now instead of having like all of these scenes as their own variables, I'm just gonna have one big scenes variable, which is an object literal. So this is an empty object literal. I'll put a comment here. And an object literal is a little bit like a class, except you can't make, well, you can, but generally you don't like make a bunch of copies of it like we did with our scenes, our portals, our game objects. An object literal, we just add individual keys. So I can say scenes.beginning, scenes.middle, and scenes.end. And all I have to do to keep track of which scene to draw is use a string that I update with the current scene. So the current scene to start is going to be beginning. And I just have to be careful to make sure that this string matches, the string of the key of the scene in my object. And then when I change the scene, I'm going to change the current scene to the scene name. Finally, the nice thing, this makes our draw loop look much cleaner, because now all I have to say is scenes at current scene.draw. And I literally don't, well, I might have to, but I probably don't have to put anything else in the draw loop. Okay, so now let's try entering the scene. So we hit the enter key. Okay, I have some other error going on here, so let's investigate that. So I'm gonna go to my map scene. Oh, you know what? I think I just wrote this wrong actually. Portal is seen to open. Okay, that's one of the problems with having really long property names. Okay, now we should be able to enter our scene. Nice, awesome. Okay, so now we're starting to get somewhere, although I didn't really, I probably want my character to end up here. So that's where our setup function is gonna come into place. But I'm glad that worked. Let's get rid of this console.log. So that's the last thing that I really need to do with these map scenes is decide where's the player going to show up when they enter the scene. So let's go back here. And that's what I'm going to use the setup function for. And I'll call the setup function for each scene after the scene gets changed. So I'll just put that right here. I'll say, once we change the current scene, we're going to say scenes at current scene dot setup. Okay, so that's how we'll call the setup function for the new scene. And so this setup function, I'm going to take this out of the main map scene because it's going to be separate for each scene. So I'm going to save that. And I'll put this in the beginning scene. I'll say setup. We'll just put the player in the middle of the scene. So I'll just say player.x equals width over 2 and player.y equals height over 2. Okay, so that's basically where the player is going to show up anyway. So that's our beginning scene. Let's try our middle scene. So he's walking down this big line. So let's say setup here. And this is a good time to point out the reason I'm doing this in setup instead of constructor. Constructor is going to get called when I say new beginning, new middle, new end. So the player is obviously going to be moving around, and so by the time they get to the middle scene, it's not going to matter where we told them to go in the constructor because that isn't going to happen again. So separating the constructor from the setup is a way that we can make some changes to what's happening in the scene after it's already been created. So for this one, I'm going to say player.x, say width over 2 again, to put it in the middle of the scene, and then y, I'm going to put it way at the top of the scene. Let's try that. Okay, perfect. So now I'm going to walk down here, and then let's put a little portal down at the bottom of this scene, and then I think we'll be done because we only have 3 scenes. So let's open. Oh, we had the middle scene open. So now I just have to add a portal here. So we'll say this is the end portal equals new portal. Let's go to single view. We need a message. Enter the, this is the final scene. So let's call it the abyss. We're going to say you're going into the abyss. I don't know why I thought of that, but whatever. Let's put this in the middle and then all the way at the bottom. So I'll say like height minus 100. And then the scene we're going to is the end scene. And then I always have to remember to push this onto my array. So this .portals.push end portal. Okay, so we're going to enter the scene. Now we've got a nice little portal down there. I'm kind of getting sick of this sign graphic, but whatever. So then we go, oh, and we never added the setup function to the end scene. So we just have to close this, open up the end scene, and add a setup function here. And we just need to set the player.x. So that's going to be on the left side because he's walking across. And player.y equals height over 2. Let's put him down a little bit from there. Okay, so now we have this one guy over here. Then we can go down here. And now we're at the end. So that was a lot, but now we have our scenes and we can move on to our platform style scene. So there's a lot to kind of do here, but most of it is just like organizing code. Hopefully it doesn't get too crazy.